All right, well, good evening, everybody. This is Wednesday night faith formation with Knollwood Baptist Church. I am Catherine Martin, interim minister of faith formation and education, and my guest this evening is John Harrison, a longtime member of Knollwood. He has written a paper called When Things Fall Apart, and we are here this evening to ask him questions about it and invite him to explore it and elaborate on it with us. This is in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic that we are making our way through this year of 2020. So it is very relevant. The subject matter of his paper is very relevant to the lives we are all living, and we look forward to fruitful discussion. So by way of introduction, I'd like to tell you a bit about John. He was raised in England in a northern English town called St. Helens, which is outside of Liverpool, an industrial town during the Second World War. He was brought up Catholic, as many of those who eventually find their way to Knollwood, and he attended a Catholic parochial school, which he left at age 15 to become an apprentice motor mechanic. And I have a feeling that could be a paper all in and of itself, but that's for another evening. He was drafted into the Royal Air Force at 21 and served 2 years in the medical section. John won a Fulbright scholarship to study in the US in Philadelphia, where he met his wife, Anne, who is also a treasured member of Knollwood Baptist. He's taught sociology at the college level and spent 30 years, the last 30 years of his career, as a social development specialist in the South Pacific, the Caribbean, West Africa, Central America, and Bangladesh. So he is not only well-traveled, but has spent many years of his life both living and working in various parts of our globe. John has been a member at Knollwood for about 25 years and teaches in the Rhotic Discovery class. And in our conversation at the beginning of the Zoom, I found out that Anne, his wife, went to Reynolds High School and is a charter member of Knollwood. I didn't know that. So she's been at Knollwood her entire life, it seems, and now they are here together. And John, I came to know of a paper written by John, which led to conversation, which led to an idea for a Wednesday night program. And so here we are. So John, I just say a fond welcome, and I'm so glad you've agreed to join us, and I look forward to fun and interesting conversation.
Right, thanks, Catherine. I was prompted to do this paper by Catherine, kind of indirectly. Must have been about March, I think. She asked if people would do things on how they were coping with COVID. And I did a one-page thing, which really is the fifth part of this longer essay. But it started me to think about it in a broader way. And so what the essay is, in effect, is an elaboration of the ideas I put together for Pages from the Pandemic, I think it was called. Mm-hmm. And what I've done, I've broken it into 5 parts. And the first part is simply a context. It just looks at the onset of COVID and its effects. The second part is a brief history of pandemics, because I think we need to learn from this, that COVID will be a history soon, we hope. And when you look at what happened in the past and what's happening now, there are certain, A, it's interesting, and B, there are certain kind of conclusions you can draw from it. I'm going to do those two parts quite briefly because you've got the paper. You can read the detail. Parts 3 and 4 are the way COVID affected the world that we take for granted. We sometimes forget that the only way to exist in the world is to take huge areas of it for granted. But once you can't do that, you're in trouble. And that's where a lot of our problems are arising with COVID. The things that we could do and not think about, we can't do anymore. And so that I'm going to cover that kind of thing in parts 3 and 4. And then the fifth part is my self-analysis, if you like. And basically it's memory. And I think memory is an interesting thing because it's a double-edged sword. It can encase kind of follies and regrets and unrealized hopes and faded dreams, but it can also be extremely self-illuminating. And I've tried to use my memories for self-illumination. So that really is what this is about. Any points on that before we launch off?
Any questions before we get started? Thank you, John, for giving that overview. And, you know, my first question to you really was, why did you write this essay? And you've already covered that. I mean, I'll just say again, you know, in the spring, I offered the opportunity to write a page from the pandemic, just an opportunity to reflect in writing on the pandemic. And John, along with several others, accepted that and did some beautiful written reflection. And so that is where this comes from. But I will take us to my very, very simple PowerPoint on this. Okay. Can everyone see this? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So it is literally the text just for us to have on our screen. Let's go to the second section. So you mentioned that COVID is a part of history, will soon be a part of what we hope will be past history.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah, it's not the first pandemic we have experienced as a world, but particularly as a Western society. So can you just give us a little perspective on pandemics throughout history?
Yeah, I mean, there have always been pandemics. I mean, you read about it in the Bible, you know, plagues of locusts and all kinds of things. I mean, that's not so much a pandemic, but I mean, there were all kinds of other diseases. So it's not something that's new. And they occur regularly, and they have done throughout history. And pandemics have actually changed history very considerably. You know, battles have been won and lost over pandemics. Nations have declined over pandemics. So they are a very impactful thing when they happen. And of course, you've got to remember, until the early 20th century, there was no way to combat this, really. There were no vaccines, there were no antibiotics, there were nothing. So people just tolerated it. The greatest outbreak was one of the earliest ones, which was in the 14th century, the Black Death. And the Black Death was the most destructive pandemic in history. It was estimated to have killed a third of the world's then population. In Europe, it killed off the medieval era. It changed the European world, mostly for the good, actually, when you think about it. But people thought it was a random act of God, the work of the devil. Why was the sacred canopy not protecting them anymore? And these were the kinds of questions people asked when they were literally knew nothing about disease. It was always the will of God, and it was always looked at through a religious lens. Barbara Tuchman, the great American historian, has written a book on this, and it's called A Distant Mirror. It's worth reading if you haven't read it. But in that, she points out that the major thing that the Black Death did was create new world views. People looked at the world differently before and after the Black Death. And we will do this with COVID. I suspect people in the United States are going to get far more interested in European medical systems as a result of this. I'm just giving that as an example of the way pandemics change worldviews. What she said was, minds that open to these questions could never again be shut. Once people envisaged the possibility of change in a fixed order, the end of submission came into sight. The turn to individual conscience lay ahead, to the extent that the Black Death may have been unrecognized, the beginning of modern man. In other words, people no longer were saying, well, what kind of God is doing this to us? They were asking, what can they do about it? Bubonic plague, strangely enough, never died out. It's still endemic in the United States, in the West. There are about 20 or 30 cases of bubonic plague in the Western states, mainly New Mexico and Arizona, every year. I'm sure you all knew that. But the most famous outbreak of it after the Black Death was the London plague. Actually, it's always called the Great Plague of London, but it was the whole of Britain. And that was in 1666. And 25% of the population died. 25% of the population of London. At that time, London had a population of about 100,000. And that happened all across the world. The first time it came to the United States was only in 1900, and there was an outbreak in San Francisco, which strangely enough was said to have been brought in from China. And there were a lot of Chinese coming into the United States at that point, so it's probably true. And then there was another outbreak, but there's not been many outbreaks since then. There have been lots of other outbreaks of disease, and they've scourged various parts of the world. The most virulent by far was the Spanish flu in 1918 to 1920. I don't know why they call it the Spanish flu, because it started in Kansas. It started at an army base in Kansas, and the troops were shipped to Europe, took the flu with them, and then it just came worldwide. And probably more people died from Spanish flu than died in the First World War. But when you add the two together, the numbers are enormous. And it's estimated that the Spanish flu killed about 50 million people. Well, you think that COVID at the moment, in 7 or 8 months, has actually infected about 8 million and killed something under 2 million. So that gives you some idea of how virulent the Spanish flu was. There are all kinds of other diseases: smallpox, cholera, yellow fever. In Philadelphia in 1793, 10% of the population died of yellow fever in Philly in 1793. In Britain, between 1831 and 1834, there were 60,000 deaths from cholera. There were, between 1848 and 49, 125,000 deaths from cholera in Britain. But again, the disease brought progress. Cholera is the beginning of public water supply. Cholera was the thing that sparked, because in the 1834 outbreak in London, a doctor traced it to a single pump in a place called Broad Street.
Dr. Snow.
Pardon? And he, and even since the 1980s, there have been a lot of outbreaks of things like Lassa fever, Ebola fever, SARS, H1N1, and so on. And they're going to keep coming, as we see. They just keep coming. I want to move on to section 3, because COVID very clearly has had catastrophic consequences in every facet of daily life. All your expectations have been changed, social relations have changed, life, death, the future, they're all not like they were before. And it's called for extraordinary resilience in people. People have had to kind of look inward and say, what is happening here? How do I deal with it? And there's been, you know, when your existence is undone, and that's what's happened at the moment. I mean, normal existence has become threadbare. It's completely undone. And of course, the main responses to it are anxiety, fear, panic, despair. And we have to look at how we face these existential hazards. And, you know, we have a culture of public health and medical research. And we've always expected that it would solve these problems, but it's finding this one a very difficult problem to solve. Of course, that it's now being said that people are losing trust in science because of that. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. And so there's a different range of responses. Some people believe entirely that science will eventually solve this problem. Other people look for supernatural answers. You still have people who say, God will sort this out, God will care for us, and so on. And, you know, that changes. And it's very interesting that in the United States, the belief in the supernatural is much stronger than it is in other parts of the world. I find that interesting. So that's about half of where we are. Any points you want to raise? I mean, do you find it useful to look at the background like this?
Very much so.
Absolutely, yes. It's so interesting to compare history or to look at history to what's happening now. And in some ways, it's almost, for me, it's been a little reassuring to know that we've been there before and mankind has carried on.
And John, one thing I really liked was what you quoted about how things changed after the plague. People saw the world differently and were open to new ideas, because I find it really encouraging to think there could be some good things to come out of this experience. And not only can we get through it and survive it, but there might be some opportunity for
I feel it's a good point, that, Spence, because I think we have to be optimistic about this. I mean, it's very difficult to be optimistic about it. But, you know, we have to kind of think, as Sarah was just saying, that, you know, if you think about if you ever read, for example, Samuel Pepys or Daniel Defoe, they both wrote books about the plague. And if you read those, they're making the same points that people make now, really, in that sense. But of course, the plague eventually went and they got on with it. And that's what will happen here. Life will become normal again. It may not be normal in the same way, but there will be some normality that will emerge out of this. And probably, as with cholera, maybe some kinds of progress. You know, maybe we'll kind of get a better understanding of how these things emanate in the first place. I mean, a lot of the argument about COVID is that it's actually a result of global warming, simply because these bats and the like were impinging on the environment. And of course, the bug jumps. And that's really seems to be what happened in China in the early part of this. But let me go on to look at the public and the onto part 4 basically, because I want to give you time to discuss this. So I'm doing this quite quickly. You know, you've got the paper, so you can actually read it. I mean, the medical authorities, they quickly understood how the virus was transmitted, and they issued the normal things for dealing with this. There are patterns for this. They'd learned from the past, you know, from the past pandemics. They learned from Ebola, they learned from Lassa, H1N1. So they had that there is a series of procedures that you can just go into, but it didn't really work in the way that it should have. Some of the infrastructure had actually been taken away that would have helped this, and that was a kind of I think a hindrance in the first place. But they did the basic things: fastidious personal hygiene, sheltering in place, masks, etc. And it works, but it doesn't work right away. And in the end, the only thing that will do this probably is a vaccine. But even the vaccines are not expected to be more than about 50 to 70% effective. So it might be like the plague, that it'll hang around a while. And I think we have to kind of anticipate that. The thing is that these procedures, sheltering in place, that was required of almost everybody, really took all the joy out of life. All the things that you previously did that were fulfilling, you couldn't do. You had to, you began to think about yourself in a different way. You know, you began to think about, well, should I go to the grocery or not? How many times do you think that? You know, and it's so it really was a really tremendous effect on this. And I think a lot of people coped with it very well. The arts sector, I think, has coped with it marvelously. They've used technology and they've got on with it, and they're still performing. They're not getting paid, but they're performing. And on Saturday, the Winston-Salem Symphony streamed its first live concert. And you can get it on the Facebook site. You can just go on and listen to it. And it was a real joy to get that. But all kinds of other musicians have done things. It's amazing what's been done. And that has been extremely effective in inspiring a lot of people, or at least quelling some of the despair. And I think that is what we have to do in this. But I mean, essentially, what it has done, what the COVID has done to everybody, is to diminish your identity. Your sense of self has been challenged and eroded. And that, you know, that might take a long while to be restored. Some people will never restore it. I mean, there's a lot of talk now about the mental health problems arising from this. And that is just a symptom of the whole business of people's identity no longer being as secure as they used to be. I want to go on to talk about my own experience of this and how I've dealt with it. I originally, when we did the pages from the pandemic, I originally called it The Language of God, which was simply a line out of this little Beethoven aphorism that music is the language of God. And in common with most people, particularly people my age, were the most vulnerable, seclusion became a real test of fortitude. You could have just vegetated. And, you know, the way you could self-express yourself changed. There was very few ways in which you could relate to other people. I mean, you know, you stand outside in the garden with a mask on to say hello. That's normal. That's real normal. So I want to talk a bit about how I looked at myself and what my past experience might help to deal with the present. As Sarah said, I was an only child, and I was brought up in the north of England, in a town that was, to say the least, grim. despite being outwardly cheerless, it was a good community to live in. People cared for each other. People helped each other. It was mainly out of common austerity that people did this. I mean, common austerity breeds its own culture. And so life was pretty somber. And this was in World War II. I was 8 when World War II ended, so I still have memories that kind of are stuck away in the corridors of wherever. And we lived very much in the shadow of death, as people think they are now. But the measures that we had to take were far more austere than COVID. We had 6 years of severe rationing. I started work in 1952. That was 7 years after the war, and certain things were still rationed. Gasoline, for example, was rationed. There was a scarcity of everything. You had to queue for everything. I remember the first banana I ever remember seeing, and we stood in line for ages, almost as long as voting, to get some bananas. And that was after the war. There were no bananas during the war. And there was a song about it. Yes, we have no bananas. There was a popular song in Britain. Yes, we have no bananas. The worst of it was, of course, there was a fear of invasion. Bombs were falling. I was a refugee for about a week after a bomb blew up part of our street. And the winters were bitterly cold. There were fuel shortages. And military defeats and casualty reports we got every day. I mean, till between 1939 and 1942, it was an endless litany of military defeats and people being killed. And people used to watch for the post boy coming on his bike with the telegram. And it was not a pleasant feeling. I had an uncle killed in North Africa, actually, and my mother's sister was killed in an air raid in Plymouth. Interestingly enough, we had masks. We had gas masks, and we had to carry them everywhere. When you went to school, you took your lunch and your gas mask. So, you know, wearing masks is not all that difficult, especially when it keeps you alive. So how did I think about this? When I was a child, I was an only child, and I was actually familiar with a degree of solitude. So that really didn't bother me so much. And I did all the things that kids did. I played sports and so on. The interesting thing was all the parks were turned into food production. So all the playing fields were ploughed up and planted. So you played in the streets. Well, there were no vehicles because nobody had any gasoline. So that wasn't dangerous. But it was pretty austere. And what I found was, outside of playing with my friends and sports and things, the things that for me were most important were reading and music. And I remember, and they were really true joys to me. And I remember reading people like W.J. Turner and James Hogg. These are poets who were poets of childhood. Kipling, Stevenson, Edward Lear, The Owl and the Pussycat, and all that kind of thing. And it took me out of myself, and it takes you to a different world. And there was nothing better than being in an imaginary different world when you lived in Britain during the war. It was a real kind of joy. But really, it was music that I felt most close to. And it was music that kind of liberated me in a way. And if I were to say that if I searched for sanctuary as a child, it was in music. And that's why I think it's called the language of God, because I had the feeling that when I was in a church and music was playing, I remember I was a Catholic, and in Catholic churches, you got real music. You just didn't get Wesley's hymns and things like that. You got real music. You got Mozart. You got all kinds of people. And it gave you a sense of being in holiness. For me, music, I always associate music with holiness, and I still do. The church I went to was a very large church. It had been built in the 1920s. It was said with the proceeds from war bonds, which is not a very good way to build a church, but still. And it had an echoing dome and a huge choir and a carillon. It had everything you imagine in a cathedral. And we used to go there on Wednesday afternoons to a service called benediction, which, as the name implies, it's simply a blessing. But it was all done in Latin and Latin hymns. And it was those Latin, for some reason, I mean, in Catholic schools, you learned church Latin. So you knew what it meant. And for some reason, those Latin hymns introduced me to a whole other different world. And Sunday Mass was even more profound. The church I went to, this St. Mary's Low House, was a Jesuit church, which is unusual. Jesuits don't have many parishes. They have a few. Jesuits are the kind of Dobermans of the Catholic Church, the best educated, but the most pious. And so we had a pretty strict upbringing. But we had a Jesuit priest who was a doctor of music, and he did the choir. And so we would sing masses and all kinds of things. And some of those I still remember very well. I remember Gounod's Sacre Coeur Mass, Mozart's Ave Verum, and all kinds of essentially classical music, but classical religious music. And so that made me feel that I was in a different realm that was not the world. It was an internal thing, it was holiness, and it was something that gave me protection from the external world. And that was worth a lot in those days. And I'm not alone in this. I mean, Martin Luther, for example, said, "My heart, which is full to overflowing, has often been calmed and refreshed by music when sick and weary." Luther, all the Calvinists and so on, did away with music in the church. Luther encouraged it because he knew it had this ability to evoke holiness. And Kurt Vonnegut, American writer, you've probably read some of his work, actually said that music was the only proof he needed of the existence of God. So out of that, I developed a real love for sacred music, and from that, a passion for opera. And opera has sustained me throughout my life. I go regularly still. We go to Chicago and Washington and all over the place, Vienna. And so out of my childhood search for sanctuary came something that has lasted for the rest of my life. And I was able to go back on that when the COVID came up, because I've reverted to the things that I read, to the music that I heard. And, you know, it fills the abyss of time. I mean, time has become an abyss in COVID. It's not, time's a funny thing anyway. And I mean, philosophers have been talking forever about time. But when you're given all the time in the world and you have to fill it, it's a tricky problem. So that basically is what I put together, and that's why I put it together. And I would have to say that the language of God has never, ever failed me. So there you are.
Thank you so much, John. I just really appreciate you sharing every word of that, sharing your paper with us, and all the ways that you expounded on all of that for us.